Welcome to episode 208 of Your Career Podcast. How often do you listen when someone talks to you? I mean, really listen to what's being said, because too often we listen to respond rather than listen to understand. And that's what this episode of Your Career Podcast is all about. Oscar Trimboli is the author of Deep Listening and is on a mission to create 100 million deep listeners around the world. He says, we speak between 125 and 175 words per minute, yet we can listen to 400 words per minute. That means that no matter how fast they speak, your mind can process 3 to 4 times more words. It's this gap that causes you to drift off and be distracted when listening. What are the conversations that you are not listening to? Oscar has worked with organizations including Cisco, Google, HSBC, News Corp, PayPal, Qantas, and TripAdvisor, helping executives and their teams to not only listen to what's said by their customers and employees, but what is unsaid. Find out about Oscar's career journey and how he handles change, and how deep listening has helped his consulting business grow. And let's welcome Oscar Trimboli to the show. Good morning, Oscar.
G'day, Jane. Looking forward to listening to your questions today.
Deep listening. I'm going to, because you are the deep listening expert, I'm going to make sure I listen intently to everything you say so that my questions are relevant. And so, the challenge is on. But before we begin, what I always like to do, Oscar, is to find out a little bit about your early career aspirations. So would you like to share with us what your ideas were when you were a little boy about careers?
I had a great role model in my parents, 2 first-generation migrants from post-war Italy. They had an amazing work ethic. My dad was a concreter, and school holidays were spent concreting. And my dad said, there is no way you're becoming a concreter, son. You will go to university. You'll be the first one in our family to go to university, and you'll become an accountant because accountants are never out of work. And I went, okay, Dad, no problem. So throughout my teenage years, I loved studying commerce and read newspapers in the business section, and my life's ambition was to go to university and become an accountant. So what I decided to do was study part-time and work full-time. I figured that was the fastest way to get experience. And Dad always says, you're never going to be the smartest in the room, but you can always be the hardest working in the room. And I thought, okay, so the hardest working would mean I would work and study at the same time. I worked for a chartered accounting firm as an audit clerk, and I counted spark plugs, literally counted spark plugs at a Jaguar dealer. That was my first job out of university as part of a stock take. And 6 weeks in, my manager, Robert, now I'm going to date myself because the spreadsheets we were working on, Jane, were A3 pieces of paper. There was no computers in those days, or at least where I was working, there was no computers. 6 weeks in, Robert said, we've got a problem. And I thought, okay. Robert said, at lunchtime, let's sit down and have a chat. And we did. And he read out 20 phone numbers to me and asked me to write them down. And I wrote down 20 phone numbers, and 16 were correct, but 4 were not. And what I'd done was I'd transposed these numbers, meaning if the number was 981, I would write 918. And Robert said, I think you've got dyscalculus. And I said, what's that? And he said, well, you've probably heard that some people struggle with reading and flip letters and words around. You do that with numbers. That means you probably don't have a career in accounting. And my world was shattered. I'd promised my dad, and, it was my life's ambition to become an accountant. And he brought his boss, Bill, in 2 weeks later, and Bill and Robert and I sat down to decide what to do about my work. And Bill said to me, Oscar, what do you know about computers? You're a youngster. I said, Bill, I know absolutely nothing about computers. He goes, oh, good. I appreciate that honesty. Look, Robert said you've got a problem with numbers, but you're a hard worker. why don't you learn computers and install computers in our accounting firm? Wind the clock 30 years forward, I'm a marketing director at Microsoft as a result of all of that. So sometimes your barriers are actually the doorway rather than the obstacle.
And how lucky has this new industry been to have you as well? And so often we think when there's a setback, we get so despondent, don't we? And we think, oh no, what else could I possibly do? But turn adversity into a new career, and just to have someone who's a little bit of a coach or a mentor to guide you, or just give you that spark of inspiration to think, oh yeah, why not? How good was that? And you've had such an amazing career, Oscar, because everything that you've done prior to Microsoft at PeopleSoft, and then Vodafone, and then an 11-year career at Microsoft, and up to director of the Microsoft Office division in Australia. It's phenomenal. And then you made this career change, and suddenly it's Oscar Trimboli, the speaker, the author, the mentor, and you've written an amazing book, Deep Listening, which we'll be talking about in a minute. But so what made you leave Microsoft, which would have been a dream career?
Yeah, I always love the way this question is asked, because I don't think I left Microsoft. And if you're ever leaving somewhere, you're probably not going for the right motivation. If you're leaving an organisation, you probably need to ask yourself a question about what is it about you, not just the organisation that's asking you or thinking about leaving. I had a great career at Microsoft. I didn't feel like I left. I felt like I had a higher calling. I was in a global budget negotiation, Jane. It was March 2012, and I can still remember it because the Microsoft office is near the Lane Cove National Park, and bushfires come through there quite regularly. So I can still smell the smoke from the bushfires coming through the air conditioning system. We had a video conference, 18 people, Seattle, Singapore, and Sydney. Complex budget negotiation. And 20 minutes into the meeting, the vice president of our area looks me straight in the eyes and says, Oscar, I want to see you after the meeting. And my stomach fell, and I just went, oh my God, I'm getting fired. How many weeks of salary have I got left in my bank account? The meeting concluded, and Tracy asked me to sit down at the end of the meeting, and she said, you have no idea what you did at the 20-minute mark. And in my head, I'm going, yep, I'm definitely getting fired because I don't even know why I'm getting fired. And she said, at the 20-minute mark, the way you listened completely changed the trajectory of this meeting. If you could code the way you listen, you could change the world. And despite Tracy saying something enormously profound, Jane, the only thing that was going through my head is I'm not fired. That's the only thing I was thinking about. And that started putting little pathways in front of me about discovering this quest to create 100 million deep listeners in the world. And I started getting asked by people at Microsoft and Microsoft resellers and executives in other companies. It's like, can you come and teach our people how to listen? Can you teach me how to listen? And it's like, I haven't got time for this listening malarkey. I've got a real job. And Tracy again said, you should look into this. You should give it a bit more thought than just something you're pushing away. And Brian, the chief financial officer, asked me to come into a meeting one day, and he called it auditing his listening. And for the first time in my life, I had to watch somebody else and notice how they listened. And I thought, wow. I debriefed Brian at the end of the meeting, and he said, wow, you made some pretty profound observations. I'm going to apply that straight away. Can you come and watch me next month? He wanted me to watch him in his team meeting, and thus started the journey to where we are today, teaching 100 million people how to listen deeply.
What a fantastic mission. It's interesting with listening because, I'm a coach, and so I listen for a living, really. But what do you think creates non-listeners? What is it that puts barriers in our way so that we don't listen to understand or listen to really hear what the other person's saying?
It's the myth that focusing on the speaker is the place you start your listening from. So you need to listen to yourself before you listen to the person you're in a conversation with. And we track a database of 1,410 listeners. We've been doing it for 3 years to see how they're making progress on their listening. And 86% of them say the biggest barrier to listening is a mobile device or a computer with notifications on it. If it buzzes, if it beeps, if it's got a red dot on it, switch it off. That will be the fastest way for you to improve your listening. And whether you're on a Mac or a PC or Android or an iPhone, there's one button called notifications. You can just move it to the right and switch off your notifications. And Jane, if everybody did that, our listening productivity would triple straight away. So the external barrier is electronic devices, yet it's the internal barrier. It's what's going on for you while you're listening right now. You're thinking about what you want to have for lunch, maybe what you shouldn't have had for breakfast, what you need to do later on this evening. And for a lot of us, it's easy to get distracted by anything. So listening to ourselves is the starting point. And I always say great listeners just know they're distracted faster. It's not that you don't get distracted. So externally, devices, and internally, our own dialogue.
You know what's so interesting? Have you heard of phone stacking? Because apparently it started in California. This is a number of years ago when people started using the mobile phones too much, and people would go for dinner with each other, and they would have a conversation, but periodically check their phones, or else the phone would ring and they would pick it up, which is the height of rudeness, really, when you're having dinner with people. And so they started this thing where they said, okay, this is what you do. Everybody, if you've got your mobile phone, put it on silent and put it in the middle of the table, and then stack them all up. And if anyone starts to get really itchy and wants to check their phone, whoever picks up their phone first is the one who has to pay for dinner for everybody. So I think that's one way of getting rid of the devices, isn't it? But it's so interesting. We're so attached to our devices now, and we think it's making us more connected. But in a way, it's making us less connected when we're face to face with each other. And you're right, as you were saying, when we're listening, sometimes your mind wanders. Then my mind started to wander. I felt very guilty just listening to you saying that. And now, because you've become this expert in deep listening, and it facilitates connection, true connection with people when we really listen, doesn't it? You've written this amazing book. And for those who are watching the video rather than just listening to the podcast, you'll be able to see, because I'm going to show it here, Oscar Trimboli's amazing book, which comes in a box, beautiful quality, deep listening, impact beyond words. And I have to say, when this arrived in the post, Oscar, I got this little bit of excitement because I thought, oh, it's like a present. It's not just a book, it's a present. And opening it up, there's this beautiful, beautiful book that not only includes a book, but there are instructions on how to use it. And all of these incredible cards that are like a prompt to ask the right questions so that you can really listen more deeply. And I love this so much. So tell me, what prompted you to write Deep Listening, Oscar?
I didn't prompt myself to write deep listening, whether it's the books, the playing cards, the jigsaw puzzles, the quiz, it all came as a result of listening to clients. So clients would keep saying to me, Oscar, I wish I had you on my shoulder during a meeting. Oh, Oscar, I wish you were there listening while I was in this conversation. Could you write a book? Could you put, and we were doing a workshop where we were using sticky notes. And at the afternoon tea break, we asked everyone to go outside, and I was taking photos because everybody had asked me to do that. And Alice said to me, she rushed back in and she said, Oscar, you're not going to throw my card in the bin. And I thought, oh, wow, she's putting a lot of value on this card that she's created. And it was a sticky note with black writing. The following day I spoke to my book editor, and Kelly said, "Oh, Oscar, it's so obvious. Make some playing cards." And Kelly and I had written the book a year earlier, and she said to me, when we wrote the book, we got in this titanic tussle because I wanted to write a book that was read, not a book that was a dusty shelf trophy, that it's there, but it's not actually used. And Jane, I've had amazing photos from people on riverbanks in Germany, hotel rooms in New York, all saying they love how small the book is, and it's easy to read and easy to reread. And it's designed to be read and applied, not just something you wish you would get around to. So there's a lot of thought gone into that. And I think, looking at what you've held up, you've got lots of sticky notes in it already. So you've spent a bit of time with it.
Definitely. And what I love is it fits in the palm of my hand, and I can just flip, it's like you sit with a cup of tea or a cup of coffee and you flip through it. And what's so lovely about this book is, besides all the amazing testimonials in it, is at the end of every chapter, you've got specific questions that you ask people and reminders of what we need to think about. And there's this one, I'm going to flip over to page 27, which is about conscious listening. And you say, when we become conscious of how we listen, we begin to listen through the following perspectives: intentional, systemic, curious, and progressive. And then I thought, what does this mean? And then reading through each explanation, it just, everything comes so much clearer. And I thought I was a good listener because I've been coaching for 20 years, but there's always something to learn and improve. And so tell us a little bit about the 4 different ways of listening through these perspectives.
Yeah, for a lot of us, I'll give you a dirty little secret of listening. For a lot of us, we think it's our job to understand what the speaker means. And it's not. Our job isn't to make sense of what the speaker is actually saying. And when we look at these 4 perspectives you've just mentioned, these perspectives are there to create a different landscape for us to listen through. And the dirty little secret of listening, it's not your job as the listener to understand what they say. It's your job to help the speaker make sense of what they mean and what they're thinking. And if we understood it, like my wife says, she'll put this on my tombstone, but if we understood the 125-900 rule, I speak at 125 words a minute, but I have 900 words stuck in my head. These intentional perspectives that we talk about, the systemic, the progressive, etc., is all about helping the speaker discover different perspectives in the way they're listening to what they're saying. Now, when you create these perspectives for people, you'll hear this magical change. So you might ask a question. The question might be, tell me more. Or the question might be, and what else? Or the question might be just a pause and silence. And Jane, tell me if you've ever noticed this happening. People will say the first sentence 1 or 2 minutes, and then you'll prompt them to say, tell me more. And they'll do this. They'll go, So they'll sigh, and then they'll say, well, actually, now that I've thought about it a little longer, we should be talking about this. Or now that I've thought about it a little longer, what's really important to me? And off we go. And these magical phrases and the little sigh means you're helping them to discover more of their thinking. Because the brain, it's like a washing machine. It's on wash cycle. It's dirty, it's sudsy, it's agitated, it's just moving around. But the act of speaking is like a rinse cycle. And it's clear water, but it's also clear thinking. Our neural pathways line up very differently when we think about a concept versus when we speak about a concept. And holding that space as the listener is there merely to help them understand what they're thinking, not for you to understand what they're saying. So those perspectives that we talked about, the 4, all came about because of the 4 villains of listening. And you know,
Intriguing.
well, our villains tend to get in our way more. You know, we talk about the conscious listening archetypes, but they're very aspirational. Our research tells us that only 2% of people in our database even have the language to understand the consciousness of these intentional listeners, yet there was nearly 82% of people in our database who talked about their barriers, their villains, what was getting in the way, the interrupting listener, the shrewd listener, the lost listener, the dramatic listener. And what I discovered was the more I talked about what got in people's ways, the easier it was for people to go, yeah, I do that. As opposed to the intentional listeners are kind of the Olympic gold medalists of listening. It's lovely to aspire to it, but, you know, most of us are never going to run a marathon. But we can definitely lace on some shoes and jog around the block every now and again. And when we talk about these listening villains, people find it much easier to access. And that's where the quiz came from. People started asking me, Oscar, yeah, you got me. You just listened to me and you saw my barriers. I wish I could take a quiz. And enough people started saying it that we created listeningquiz.com, where in 7 minutes you can take the quiz and find out what's really getting in your way.
I think that would be a valuable quiz, because we all think that we listen, but we don't. And you know what's interesting? There's one question I like to ask when I'm working with my coachees, and is to initially pause and not say anything at all. And they're normally a little bit surprised, like, why isn't Jane saying anything? And I'm just nodding and going, And then they start to think a little bit, well, deeper, I guess, about why isn't she responding? Does she want more from me? And then they start to go around. You can see the look in their eyes as well. And I like to say, you know, what are you really saying here? What are you really telling me? Because it's usually something completely different, isn't it? And that's what's so exciting about really listening to someone. And you tell me, most listeners, and I think I'm guilty of this as well, is that when we're speaking, we assume people will know what we mean. And we might not say it in the right way or say enough. And then we get a bit annoyed when someone doesn't understand. But the problem is it's our own fault for not communicating clearly enough.
Yeah, and the maths, ironically, for somebody with dyscalculia, the maths of the 125/900 rule means we're having dialogue with only 11% of what people are thinking. 11%. Can I just play with something you mentioned earlier on? You posed the question, what are you really telling me? And just for illustrative purposes, this is a beautiful example of you listening for what they mean and them interpreting the question. I think the question I would pose in that moment is, what are you really thinking? Because it gets them back into their head and get them out. What are you trying to tell me? It's kind of, what am I trying to tell Jane, as opposed to, what am I thinking? Do you get the distinction between the two?
Yeah.
So that's the trouble when you're working with a deep listening guy. He's even going to listen to you while you're talking to him.
I love it. I love it. And, you know, I want to just show people who can see, and looking at the video, these beautiful cards that come with the book, Deep Listening. And just want to share what's in two of the cards. One is listening to the meaning. And when you flip the card over, it talks about the concept, the explanation, there's a little tip, and then questions that you can ask as well. So with listening to the meaning, the concept is opportunity. Then the explanation is listening for opportunities creates transformational impact. And you provide a tip. Opportunities always present themselves when you listen with focus and flexibility. And that's wonderful, because keeping an open mind and a curious mind is so good. And so here's a question that you suggest that we could ask is, if we had 24 hours more to think about this, what other opportunities would emerge? What a wonderful thing to do in a brainstorming session as well. Yeah, I love this. And do you use these in group sessions when you do your group workshops?
Yeah, they're used individually. They're used in pairs. They were used in groups. And there's a funny story about a managing director who was using it in a sales meeting. So every month you brought your problem sales to this meeting and everybody kind of picked a card and off they went. Unfortunately, nobody told the new hire. So everybody brought these boxes to the meeting and he walked straight out. And the managing director went, oh, okay. So he went and spoke to him after the meeting and he said, oh, I thought you were all opening the Bible and I don't believe in Christianity. And he said, no, it's not a Bible. They're listening cards. And, so they can have unintended consequences sometimes.
The all-knowing Oscar Trimboli. Oh, my goodness, you've written a Bible as well. Well, here's another card that I like is listening to the unsaid, which is so important, isn't it? So the concept here is unsaid. The explanation is listening beyond words. How beautiful is that? And the tip is the unsaid is 3 times more impactful than what is said. So true, yes? And questions that you could ask, and I love this because it's a little bit like what we were saying earlier. Question was, what I'm curious about is what haven't we discussed so far? That would make people pause and think. Yeah?
Yeah, you just did it there with your little
But, it's a little bit like hypnotic language and saying things like, carry on, go on, yes, yes. It's little noises. It's very encouraging for the person who's speaking too, to get more out of them.
And how this plays out in our modern video conferenced world is the unsaid is often the people you're not hearing from. And it's not just the role of the host, it's also participants. But, in a meeting of 6 people, it's likely to be dominated by 2 with an occasional sprinkling of some salt and pepper from 2 other people. And then there's 2 other people just not part of the discussion. And so it's not just what's unsaid in a dialogue, it's who isn't being heard from and who isn't being listened to and who might have a different perspective. And sometimes they may not even be in the video conference. They might be perspectives we need to think about afterwards. I was running a workshop in Melbourne and we'd heard from everybody at 5 to 1. And the reason I knew it was 5 to 1 because the CEO was tapping on his desk and pointing to his watch as if he was hungry. And we hadn't heard from Eileen, who was over on the right-hand side. Eileen was from finance and a card-carrying member of the introvert community. And I just gestured to her. We were doing an exercise, describe this organisation as an animal. Everybody described it as an eagle, an osprey, a bird of prey, something that moved fast and swooped and was elegant and agile. And Eileen, when I gestured to her, she said, I thought it was obvious. I thought we were a snake. And the tension in the room went up dramatically. The CEO had these laser beam eyes kind of trying to explode my head, saying, well, if you would have cut it off and we would have had lunch, we wouldn't have heard this. And I just gestured with my palm out to Eileen and she said more. She said, we've forgotten to shed our skin. And we have old processes and we are not shedding our skin for what our customers need us to become. Now, the part of the story about Eileen is when you think about a snake, Jane, you probably think quite negative things. But from her culture in the East, snakes are revered. They're seen as something quite skillful, elegant, and they can sense in advance as well. So in that moment, the meeting changed and we didn't eat lunch till 1/2 the hour. And the CEO was so curious and the dialogue changed dramatically from groupthink to where aren't we shedding our skin? And that was a big step change for that organisation because they realised they'd held on too tightly to the past and they weren't really listening not only to their customers, but they weren't listening to all their staff as well. So when we think about what's unsaid, it's not just what's unsaid between you and I, it's who aren't we listening to.
And I think also, especially because during these COVID days as well, and we're having so many video conferences and the virtual teams are getting together, we need to be mindful of the cultural differences. And I'm half Chinese, so I understand, the difference in the way, like a Westerner would think a snake in the grass, for example, or, evil, whereas in the Asian culture, my mother loved snakes. She was a Chinese from Hong Kong. And I think you have to be very careful with the listening over video conference, because you do lose a little bit of that physical presence. You can still have the positive body language, but the physical presence makes a huge difference, doesn't it?
Yeah. And again, a lot of us focus on what we're losing with video conferencing, but I also think, what are we gaining? And the game I always play in my group workshops at the moment is, what colour eyes has Oscar got? And bloodshot eyes is not the correct answer, by the way.
I was going to say.
and yet, 4 weeks ago, I was doing this workshop, and in the background behind one of the participants was a bust of a person. And I had to ask them what this bust was. And, because what we're gaining is we're going into people's homes. We're going into places we would never have been invited into in the pre-COVID context. And as a result, I discovered an amazing story. This was a bust of his dad in Central America. There's a tradition that the elder son, when the father passes away, gets this bust. But it became a story about how his wife, they were married for 3 months, they went over to Central America for the funeral, and she carried the bust all the way back through all the airports. And it was an 8-kilo bust. And she said, look, you got enough to deal with your dad. Let me deal with the people at quarantine, and let me deal with the people at customs. And I would never know that story. And now all of a sudden we're really in tuned in our conversations about what else in his cultural background is showing up in work, and what are the good things about his culture that they can bring into the conversation. So I've discovered some amazing food as a result.
I love the video conferencing because it gives you a little bit of a sneak peek into other people's lives, unless you have a green screen like I do now, and you can't see the mess behind me, really. Although I try to be as neat as possible. Oscar, I could speak with you all day, all night, and I could just listen and listen. And I know if I said anything, you'd be listening and understanding as well. Thank you so much for this beautiful book. And tell us, where can we find you, Oscar?
If you visit listeningquiz.com, that's the best place to go. That will give you the 7-minute quiz, the 5-page report tailored exactly to your answers, and give you a little bit of an action plan, and that will connect you with the resources about the book and the playing cards and the jigsaw puzzle. And if you want to listen to Oscar interviewing High Court judges or deaf interpreters, foreign language interpreters, suicide counsellors, air traffic controllers, about how they listen in life and death situations, you can go to listeningquiz.com.
Oh, fantastic. I'll put this in my show notes on janejacksoncoach.com as well, so easy to click and take the quiz, and I would highly recommend it. And also, honestly, if you haven't got it already, get deep listening, because it's just the most beautiful, but just looking at it makes me happy. And looking at each card gives me another idea of, oh, okay, that's what I could be saying instead too. And I thought I listened for a living. No, I've learned a lot from you, Oscar. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. And I think this is going to be a truly valuable episode.
Thanks for listening.
Bye now. If you enjoy Your Career Podcast, please hop over to iTunes and leave a review, because that's how we get to reach more people. And if you need help in your career, go to www.thecareersacademy.online, where you'll be able to find lots of online programs as well as one-on-one coaching with me. See you soon.